Beneath the crumbling desert arch, she felt the ground sink, as if something was tunneling directly toward her. The sensation came first as a whisper of movement, a subtle displacement of sand beneath her boots that made her stomach drop before her mind could fully process the danger. Maya stood frozen beneath the ancient stone formation, her body instinctively understanding what her conscious thoughts were still struggling to accept. The arch above her, weathered by millennia of wind and heat into a graceful curve of rust-colored sandstone, had stood here long before human memory, a testament to the patient violence of time. Now, in this moment, as the ground beneath her feet began its slow, inexorable descent, she realized that time had finally run out. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast emptiness of ochre and shadow that seemed to swallow sound itself. She had been walking for 3 days since her vehicle had died in a gully 30 miles back, the engine seizing with a final shudder that echoed like a death rattle across the dunes. Her water supply had dwindled to a single half-empty bottle that sloshed mockingly against her hip with each step. The sun hung overhead like a malevolent eye, bleaching the world into gradients of white and gold, and burning away any thought that wasn't focused on the next step, the next breath, the next moment of survival. She had sought shelter beneath the arch an hour ago, desperate for relief from the relentless heat. The shadow it cast was thin and inadequate, but after hours of exposure to the brutal afternoon sun, even this meager protection felt like a blessing. She had collapsed against one of the arch's massive support pillars, her back pressed against stone that radiated warmth like a dying coal. Her clothing clung to her body, soaked through with sweat that evaporated almost as quickly as it formed, leaving white salt stains across the fabric. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes burned from squinting against the glare. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but rest was impossible now. The ground sank another inch, and Maya lurched forward, her arms wine-milling as she fought for balance. Dust billowed up around her boots in small puffs that caught the light like particles of gold. The sensation was unmistakable now, not the gradual settling of loose sand, but something deliberate, something purposeful. The earth was being displaced from below, pushed aside by something massive, moving through the substrate like a swimmer through water. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stumbled away from the arch's center, her boots sliding on the unstable surface. She had heard stories during her brief stops in the scattered outposts that dotted the desert's periphery, tales told by weathered prospectors and half-mad wanderers about things that lived beneath the sand, creatures that had adapted to the hostile underground environment over countless generations, becoming something neither fully animal nor fully comprehensible to human understanding. She had dismissed the stories as folklore, the kind of mythology that springs up in any wilderness where isolation and fear intermingle. Now, feeling the ground ripple beneath her like the surface of disturbed water, she wasn't so certain. The arch groaned above her, a deep bass note that resonated through the stone and into her bones. Cracks appeared along its surface, hairline fractures that spread like lightning across the ancient rock. Fragments of sandstone began to rain down, first as dust, then as pebbles, then as fist-sized chunks that shattered against the ground with sharp reports. Maya threw her arms over her head and ran, her exhausted legs protesting every movement as she pushed herself toward the edge of the arch's shadow. Behind her, the ground collapsed. The sound was apocalyptic, a thunderous grinding of stone against stone punctuated by the hiss of cascading sand. Maya didn't look back. She threw herself forward in a desperate dive as the earth fell away behind her, her body hitting the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. She rolled, her backpack digging painfully into her shoulders, and came up on her knees just in time to see the arch's western pillar sink into the newly formed crater. The entire structure tilted, its ancient equilibrium destroyed in an instant. The arch that had stood for millennia began its final descent, moving with the terrible inevitability of geological time compressed into seconds. The eastern pillar held for a moment longer, standing alone like a monument to futility, before it too surrendered to gravity and disappeared into the widening hole. Dust exploded outward in a massive plume that rolled across the desert like a tidal wave of ochre and gold. It engulfed Maya completely, blinding her, choking her, filling her mouth and nose with the taste of ancient stone and dry earth. She pressed her face against the ground and covered her head with her arms, making herself as small as possible as debris rained down around her. Chunks of sandstone the size of her torso slammed into the sand mere feet away, their impacts sending vibrations through the ground that she felt in her teeth. And then, beneath it all, beneath the roar of collapse and the cascade of stone, she heard something else. Movement. Not the random settling of disturbed earth, but something organic, something alive. A sliding, scraping sound that spoke of scales or chitin dragging across rock, of massive coils unwinding in darkness, of a predator made patient by eons of evolution in an environment where prey was scarce and precious. The dust began to settle, and Maya forced herself to her feet, despite every instinct screaming at her to stay down, to play dead, to become invisible. But she knew, with the certainty born of 3 days alone in this merciless place, that invisibility was impossible. Whatever had caused the collapse already knew she was here. It had felt her footsteps, sensed the vibrations of her presence. Perhaps it had even orchestrated the arch's destruction deliberately, collapsing the ground to flush her out into the open. The crater before her was perhaps 30 feet across, its edges unstable and crumbling. The arch had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the earth as if it had never existed. She could see into the hole now, past the outer rim of collapse, where loose sand continued to stream downward in rivulets. Below was darkness, not the simple absence of light, but something deeper and more absolute, a blackness that seemed to absorb the desert sun, rather than merely existing in shadow. And from that darkness came sound, a low vibration that she felt more than heard, a frequency that resonated in her chest cavity and made her vision blur. It rose and fell in a rhythm that was almost like breathing, if breathing could be done by something massive and ancient and utterly alien to surface life. Maya took a step backward, then another, her eyes locked on the crater's edge. That's when she saw it emerge. Not fully. The thing was too large for that, too impossibly vast to reveal itself all at once. But a portion of it breached the surface, breaking through the collapsing sand like a whale surfacing from black water. It was a segment of body, if body was even the right word for it. Plated scales the color of tarnished bronze caught the sunlight, each one as large as her palm, overlapping in patterns that suggested armor designed by some mad architect. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed to defy their apparent weight, sliding over and under each other as muscles beneath contracted and released. The segment rose higher, and Maya saw that it was curved, part of something coiled or bent. The scales continued upward for 10 feet, 15, 20, before the thing withdrew back into the crater with a speed that belied its size. Sand avalanched down after it, but not before Maya caught a glimpse of something else, a series of appendages or protrusions along the body's length, each one tipped with something that gleamed like obsidian in the harsh light. Her paralysis broke all at once, and she turned and ran. The desert floor was treacherous, covered in loose sand that shifted beneath each footfall and turned every step into a calculated risk. Her backpack bounced against her shoulders, the few remaining supplies inside rattling with each jarring impact. Her water bottle, her precious, irreplaceable water bottle, slipped free from its holder and tumbled away behind her. She didn't stop to retrieve it. Survival had been reduced to its most basic equation: distance between herself and the thing that was even now tunneling beneath the sand, following her vibrations, closing the gap with the patient efficiency of a predator that had never learned the meaning of failure. The sun beat down on her mercilessly, and she felt her body beginning to shut down from the combination of heat, dehydration, and pure adrenal exhaustion. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Her breath came in ragged gasps that burned her throat, but she kept moving because stopping meant death, and death in this place would be neither quick nor clean. Behind her, the ground erupted. The creature breached fully this time, rising from the sand like a revelation from hell. Maya risked a glance backward, and immediately wished she hadn't. The thing was segmented, its body composed of dozens of armored sections that moved independently of each other in a way that made her eyes hurt to follow. Each segment was perhaps 6 feet in diameter, covered in those bronze scales that reflected the sunlight in fractured patterns. But it was the front of the creature that seized her attention and locked her breath in her throat. A head, if such a thing could be called a head, emerged from the sand. It was roughly triangular, wider at the base than the apex, with a surface that seemed to be composed entirely of interlocking plates that shifted and rearranged themselves constantly. Where eyes should have been, there were only depressions, dark pits that might have been sensory organs, or might have been something else entirely. The lower portion split open to reveal not a mouth, but a series of grinding appendages, mandibles or maxillae arranged in concentric circles that rotated against each other with a sound like stones grinding in a mill. The creature oriented toward her with terrible certainty. Despite having no visible eyes, it knew exactly where she was. It could feel her, taste her presence through the vibrations in the sand, track her heat signature against the cooler desert floor. It was built for this environment in ways she could never hope to match. This was its domain, its hunting ground, and she was merely prey that had wandered too far from safety. Maya changed direction, angling toward a formation of rocks that jutted from the sand, perhaps 200 yards to her left. If she could reach solid stone, get off the sand entirely, maybe she could break the connection between her movements and the creature's senses. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only option she had that didn't end with her being pulled down into the darkness to die in ways she didn't want to imagine. The creature submerged again with a sound like 1,000 swords being drawn from scabbards simultaneously. The sand where it had breached collapsed inward, forming a new crater that began filling almost immediately as the surrounding desert attempted to restore equilibrium. Maya focused on the rocks ahead, forcing her burning legs to move faster, pushing through the exhaustion that threatened to drag her down with every step. The desert floor began to slope upward, a subtle incline that turned each footfall into an exercise in controlled falling. Her boots slipped in the loose sand, and she went down on one knee, catching herself with her hands before she could faceplant entirely. The brief pause cost her precious seconds, and she felt the ground begin to shake beneath her as the creature closed the distance. She scrambled forward on hands and knees, her palms tearing on sharp edges of stone that had been exposed by wind erosion. Blood dripped from her abraded skin and was swallowed immediately by the thirsty sand. She reached the base of the rock formation and pulled herself upward, her fingers finding purchase in cracks and crevices that had been carved by centuries of thermal expansion and contraction. The rocks were hot enough to burn, and she felt the skin of her palms beginning to blister as she climbed. But solid stone had never felt so welcoming, so absolutely necessary for survival. She hauled herself up onto a flat shelf about 15 feet above the desert floor and collapsed onto her back, her chest heaving as she sucked in air that felt like it had been heated in an oven. Below her, the sand exploded. The creature breached again, but this time it was different. This time it was angry. Its segmented body thrashed in the air, each section moving independently in a display that was almost hypnotic in its alien grace. The grinding appendages that served as its mouth rotated faster, creating a sound that rose and fell in pitch like a living siren. It crashed back down onto the desert floor with an impact that sent tremors through the rock formation, and Maya felt the stone beneath her body shudder in response. For a moment she thought the creature would attempt to climb after her. Its forward segments reared up, reaching toward the rock face with those obsidian-tipped protrusions extended. But it seemed unable or unwilling to leave the sand entirely. After several seconds of futile reaching, it withdrew, its body coiling and uncoiling in what might have been frustration, or might have been a precursor to another attack strategy. Maya lay on the hot stone and tried to process what had just happened. Her mind felt sluggish, thoughts moving through her consciousness like objects submerged in amber. The heat was affecting her more severely than she had realized. She needed water. She needed shelter from the sun. She needed rest. But all those things were impossible now, denied to her by the creature that circled the base of the rocks below, its presence marked by the periodic upheaval of sand as it moved beneath the surface. She forced herself into a sitting position and assessed her situation with the cold pragmatism that had kept her alive so far. Her backpack had survived the climb, though several straps had torn and would need repair. Inside, she found a first aid kit with dwindling supplies, a multi-tool, a flashlight with questionable battery life, and a crumpled map that showed her location relative to the nearest settlement, still over 40 miles away across open desert. No water, no food beyond a single protein bar that had been crushed into fragments inside its wrapper, no realistic means of calling for help, as her satellite phone had died along with her vehicle's electrical system back in that gully. She was, in every meaningful sense, completely on her own. The sun continued its arc across the sky, and Maya watched its progress with a growing sense of dread. In a few hours it would set, and the desert would transform from a furnace into a freezer. Temperatures that climbed above 100 degrees during the day could plummet to near freezing once darkness fell. She had no cold weather gear adequate for that kind of temperature swing. Her clothing, designed for heat management, would provide almost no insulation against the bitter cold. But staying on these rocks until nightfall might be her only option. The creature below showed no signs of leaving. It circled and circled, its movements creating concentric rings in the sand that spiraled outward from the rock formation like a grotesque mandala. Occasionally it would breach the surface, its armored head emerging to orient toward her position before submerging again. It was patient in the way that only a creature perfectly adapted to its environment could be patient. It could wait hours, days, weeks if necessary. Time meant nothing to something that had evolved to survive in a place where prey was scarce and opportunities to feed were rare enough to be worth any investment of energy. Maya used her multi-tool to fashion a crude shelter from what remained of her torn backpack straps and a lightweight emergency blanket she found compressed at the bottom of her pack. The metallic surface of the blanket reflected the sun's heat back toward the sky, creating a small pocket of shade that might reduce her body temperature by a few crucial degrees. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in this place, something was infinitely better than nothing. As she worked, her mind drifted to the decisions that had brought her here. The contract job that had seemed too good to refuse. Surveying mineral deposits in one of the most remote regions on the planet. The shortcuts she had taken. The safety protocols she had dismissed as overly cautious. The confidence that had convinced her she could handle anything this desert threw at her. Pride, she thought bitterly, had always been her greatest weakness. The desert had a way of teaching humility to those who survived long enough to learn the lesson. A sound snapped her attention back to the present, a different sound than the creature's grinding approach. This was higher-pitched, almost musical, like wind chimes made of glass and bone. Maya scanned the horizon and felt her heart sink. A sandstorm was approaching from the north. She could see it now, a wall of churning darkness that rose from the desert floor to heights that seemed to challenge the sky itself. Lightning flickered within the storm's depths, not the branching electrical discharges of a thunderstorm, but strange, diffuse glows that pulsed and faded like the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. The storm moved with unnatural speed, covering miles in minutes, and she realized with sick certainty that it would reach her position long before she could find better shelter. The creature below seemed to sense the storm's approach. Its circling became more agitated, its breaching more frequent. It rose fully from the sand one more time, its segmented body extending upward in a display that revealed its true length. At least 60 feet of armored horror that tapered from the massive head down to a tail section covered in those obsidian spikes. Then it dove back beneath the surface and was gone, tunneling away toward whatever refuge it kept in the labyrinthine passages beneath the desert floor. Maya secured her makeshift shelter as best she could and braced herself for impact. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow, wind shrieking across the rocks with enough velocity to scour flesh from bone. Sand filled the air in such density that breathing became an exercise in controlled drowning, each inhalation bringing more grit and dust into her lungs. She pressed her face against the hot stone and pulled her shirt up over her nose and mouth, creating a crude filter that did almost nothing to keep out the particles that seemed to find their way into every crevice of her body. The world disappeared into chaos. The storm erased all boundaries between earth and sky, between solid matter and atmosphere. She existed in a void of screaming wind and stinging sand, unable to see beyond her own hands, unable to hear anything except the storm's fury. Time became meaningless. Minutes or hours could have passed, and she would have no way of knowing. When the storm finally broke, it did so with the same abruptness with which it had arrived. The wind died to a whisper, and the sand settled back toward earth like a curtain being drawn aside to reveal the stage beneath. Maya lifted her head and immediately regretted it, as every muscle in her body protested the movement. She was covered in sand from head to foot, entombed in a layer of grit that had worked its way into her clothing, her hair, her ears, the corners of her eyes. The landscape had changed. The storm had rearranged the desert's topography, erasing old dunes and creating new ones, burying some features and exposing others that had been hidden beneath the surface. The rock formation where she sheltered had survived, but barely. Large sections had been scoured smooth by the wind-driven sand, and several precarious-looking cracks had appeared in the stone that made her question the wisdom of remaining here much longer. The sun was lower now, approaching the horizon in a way that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep crimson. In another hour, maybe less, darkness would fall. Maya's throat felt like it had been lined with broken glass. Her lips were cracked so badly that they bled when she tried to open her mouth. She had perhaps 12 hours before dehydration began causing irreversible damage to her organs. She needed to move, needed to find water or reach the settlement, or do something other than lie here and wait for her body to fail. The creature might be gone, driven off by the storm, or simply choosing to hunt elsewhere. This might be her only opportunity to cross the open desert without that segmented horror tracking her every movement. Maya gathered her scattered supplies and prepared to descend from the rocks. Her hands shook as she worked, and she had to stop several times to fight back waves of dizziness that threatened to send her tumbling from her perch. She was in worse shape than she had realized. The storm had taken more out of her than she had energy left to give. She was halfway down the rock face when she saw it. The storm had exposed something that had been buried beneath the sand, a structure of some kind, ancient and weathered but unmistakably artificial. It emerged from the newly rearranged dunes like a bone protruding from flesh, its angles too precise to be natural, its surfaces too smooth to have been carved by wind alone. Maya changed direction mid-descent, her curiosity overriding her caution. Shelter was shelter, and if this structure had survived intact beneath the sand for however many centuries or millennia, it might offer protection better than anything she could improvise on her own. She reached ground level and immediately sank ankle-deep into sand that had been loosened by the storm. Each step was an effort that consumed energy she didn't have to spare, but she pushed forward, drawn by the promise of walls and ceiling, and perhaps even water if the ancients who had built this place had been wise enough to include such amenities in their construction. The structure revealed itself gradually as she approached. It was made of the same rust-colored sandstone as the collapsed arch, but the blocks had been cut and fitted with such precision that she could barely see the seams between them. Hieroglyphs or pictographs covered the visible surfaces, their meanings lost to time, but their craftsmanship still evident in the deep, clean lines that had survived erosion better than the stone itself. An entrance yawned before her, a rectangular opening perhaps 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide that descended into darkness. Cool air flowed outward from the interior, and Maya felt it against her burning skin like a benediction. She approached cautiously, her flashlight drawn and ready despite the questionable state of its batteries. Every instinct screamed at her not to enter, not to exchange the known dangers of the open desert for whatever unknown horrors might lurk in the structure's depths. But thirst has a way of overriding instinct. The promise of shade and coolness and possibly water was too strong to resist. Maya took a deep breath, clicked on her flashlight, and stepped across the threshold into the darkness beyond. The interior was cooler by at least 20 degrees, the stone walls providing insulation against the desert heat that felt miraculous after days of unrelenting exposure. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor that extended forward into depths she couldn't immediately gauge. The walls were covered in more of those hieroglyphs, arranged in panels that suggested narrative or instruction. She ran her fingers across one set and felt the grooves worn smooth by time and the touch of countless hands before hers. The corridor sloped downward, descending into the earth at an angle that made her wonder how deep this structure actually went. She moved slowly, testing each step before committing her weight, aware that a fall here could be fatal and would almost certainly go undiscovered. Her footsteps echoed oddly in the enclosed space, bouncing back at her from walls and ceiling in ways that made it difficult to judge the corridor's true dimensions. After perhaps 50 feet of careful navigation, the corridor opened into a chamber. Maya swept her flashlight across the space and caught her breath. The room was enormous, its ceiling supported by columns carved from single pieces of stone that rose like trees in a petrified forest. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in those pictographs, and she could see now that they told a story, figures that might have been human engaged in activities that ranged from mundane to alarming, planting and harvesting, building and destroying, worshipping before altars that supported shapes she couldn't quite parse. And in the center of the chamber, catching the light in a way that made her heart leap, was a pool of water. She ran toward it, abandoning caution in her desperate need for hydration. The pool was perhaps 10 feet across, its surface absolutely still, reflecting her flashlight beam back at her like a mirror. She dropped to her knees at its edge and reached out with trembling hands, ready to scoop the precious liquid into her mouth. Her fingers touched the surface, and the world exploded into sensation. Not pain, exactly, though there was an element of that in what she experienced. It was more like information, raw and unfiltered, pouring into her consciousness faster than her mind could process it. Images flickered through her awareness. Visions of the desert as it had been millennia ago, green and lush and covered in vegetation she couldn't name. Creatures moving through forests that shouldn't exist, their forms shifting and uncertain, as if the act of observation couldn't quite pin them down into single, definite shapes. And then the change. A gradual withering as water receded, and greenery turned brown and died. The land transforming into the hostile waste she knew, the life that had covered it retreating underground, adapting, becoming something new and terrible in the darkness beneath the sand. The creatures that had once walked openly in sunlight learning to tunnel and hunt in places where light never reached, their bodies changing across generations to match their new environment, growing larger and stranger until they bore almost no resemblance to their surface-dwelling ancestors. The vision released her as suddenly as it had seized her, and Maya fell backward, gasping for breath. Her hand was still wet from the pool's water, and she could see now that the liquid wasn't water at all, or at least not entirely water. It had a faint luminescence to it, a blue-green glow that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She raised her hand to her mouth and tasted it cautiously. Sweet, cool, more refreshing than anything she had ever experienced, as if the act of drinking it restored not just her body's hydration, but something deeper, some essential vitality she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She drank more, cupping the liquid in her hands and lifting it to her lips again and again until her desperate thirst began to ease. Only then did she notice the figure watching her from the far side of the chamber. It stood motionless in the shadows beyond her flashlight's reach, tall and thin in a way that seemed wrong, proportions slightly off in ways her mind struggled to accept. Maya fumbled for her flashlight, which had rolled away during her vision, and trained the beam on the figure. It wasn't human, had never been human, despite the roughly humanoid shape it presented. The creature was perhaps 7 feet tall, its body covered in something that might have been skin, or might have been scales so fine they appeared as smooth flesh from a distance. Its head was elongated, featuring a prominent brow ridge above eyes that reflected her flashlight beam with a greenish shine. The mouth, when it opened, revealed teeth that were too numerous and too uniform, like the interior of some predatory fish. But the most disturbing aspect was its stillness. The creature didn't breathe, didn't shift its weight, didn't perform any of the small, unconscious movements that mark living things. It simply stood and watched her with those reflective eyes, waiting for her to make the first move. Maya got slowly to her feet, her hand reaching for the multi-tool at her belt. The creature tracked the movement with its eyes, but made no move to approach or retreat. Up close, she could see that the walls behind it were different from the others in the chamber. Where the other walls were covered in pictographs, these were smooth and featureless, except for a series of depressions that might have been controls or might have been decorative elements. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice rough from days of disuse and dehydration. "I'm just passing through. Just needed water and shelter." The creature tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost bird-like, considering her words. Then it raised one elongated finger and pointed past her, back toward the corridor she had descended. The message was clear. Leave. Maya nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact with the creature as she backed toward the corridor entrance. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing, what it meant. If this thing lived here, if it had been living here undisturbed for who knew how long, then the ancient structure might not be as abandoned as it had first appeared. And if there was one of these creatures, there might be more. The tunnels beneath the desert might be a warren of passages and chambers, a whole ecosystem existing in parallel to the surface world, hidden and hostile to intruders. She reached the corridor and turned, moving as quickly as she dared toward the entrance and the open desert beyond. Behind her, she heard a sound that might have been footsteps, or might have been something else. Something that moved through the structure's spaces in ways that didn't require contact with the ground. She didn't look back. Looking back would cost her precious seconds, and she had already used up any margin for error she might have possessed. The entrance appeared ahead, a rectangle of fading daylight that looked like salvation despite the harsh environment it represented. Maya burst through the opening and stumbled out onto the sand, her momentum carrying her several steps before she could regain her balance. She spun around, expecting to see the creature following her, but the entrance was empty, dark, still. The sun had nearly set, painting the western horizon in shades of blood and fire. Long shadows stretched across the sand, and the temperature was already dropping in that precipitous way unique to desert environments. Maya knew she had perhaps an hour before darkness fell completely, and another hour after that before the cold became life-threatening. But her brief time in the structure had restored her in ways beyond simple hydration. She felt stronger, more focused, as if that glowing liquid had been some kind of concentrated nutrient solution designed to sustain life in the harshest possible conditions. Her vision was clearer. Her thoughts came more easily. Even the pain of her various injuries had receded to a dull ache that was manageable rather than debilitating. She pulled out her map and studied it in the fading light, trying to orient herself relative to the rock formation and the ancient structure. If her calculations were correct, she was perhaps 35 miles from the nearest settlement now, assuming she could maintain a northeastern heading and avoid the various obstacles the desert would place in her path. 35 miles of open terrain where anything might be lurking beneath the sand, waiting for the vibrations of her footsteps to reveal her position. The smart play was to wait for full darkness, when the desert's nocturnal predators would be active, but the heat would be manageable, and her movements would be harder for underground creatures to track. The cold would be brutal, but she had survived cold before. What she hadn't survived, what no one could be expected to survive, was another encounter with that segmented horror that had chased her to the rocks. Maya made her decision. She would rest here until full darkness, using the time to tend to her injuries and eat what remained of her food supplies. Then she would move, navigating by the stars and the subtle topographic features visible in moonlight, putting as much distance as possible between herself and this place before dawn, brought both heat and visibility. She found a depression in the sand, sheltered by a ridge of exposed stone, and settled into it, her back against the rock. From here, she could see the entrance to the ancient structure, dark and forbidding in the twilight. Nothing emerged from it. Nothing moved across the surrounding sand. The desert was settling into its nocturnal routine, the shift between day and night marked by subtle changes in sound and temperature that would be imperceptible to anyone who hadn't spent days learning to read this environment's moods. The stars came out one by one, and Maya found herself transfixed by their clarity. Away from any light pollution, the night sky revealed itself in all its ancient glory. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and she could pick out constellations that were normally invisible from anywhere with human habitation. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, a reminder that the universe contained more than just survival and suffering and fear. When full darkness finally arrived, she moved. Her body was stiff from the brief rest, but the mysterious liquid from the underground pool seemed to have granted her reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She set out northeast, using the stars to maintain her bearing, moving across sand that had cooled to a temperature that was almost pleasant after the day's brutal heat. For the first hour, nothing disturbed her progress. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its features reduced to gradients of shadow under the moonlight. She moved carefully but steadily, keeping her footsteps as light as possible to minimize vibrations, while still maintaining a pace that would cover meaningful distance before dawn. The second hour brought the first sign of trouble, a disturbance in the sand ahead, visible even in the low light as a series of parallel ridges that ran perpendicular to her path. She recognized them immediately. Tunnels. The underground passages crossed beneath the surface here, close enough that the roof of compacted sand had partially collapsed under its own weight. She could see dark openings every few dozen yards where the tunnels had breached completely, yawning holes that descended into absolute darkness. Maya adjusted her course, trying to find a path that avoided the tunnel system entirely. but the ridges extended in both directions farther than she could see, and attempting to circumvent them would cost her hours she couldn't afford to lose. She would have to cross directly over the tunnel network and hope that nothing below sensed her passage. She approached the first ridge cautiously, testing the sand's stability before committing her weight. It held, and she crossed quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. The second ridge was the same. The third, fourth, fifth, all crossed without incident. She began to think she might make it through when the sand ahead of her erupted with violent force. A creature emerged, but not the segmented horror from earlier. This one was different. Smaller, no more than 8 feet long, but built for speed rather than raw power. Its body was streamlined, covered in overlapping plates that looked like they could fold flat against its form to reduce drag as it swam through sand. The head was wedge-shaped, featuring a beak-like protrusion that opened to reveal serrated edges, designed for shearing rather than grinding. It oriented toward her instantly, and she realized her mistake. The tunnel system wasn't just a single creature's domain. It was a network of passages used by multiple species, each adapted to exploit different niches in the subterranean ecosystem. She had walked directly into a hunting ground. Maya ran. The creature pursued with a sinuous grace that was terrifying to watch, its body undulating as it moved half through sand and half through air. She could hear it behind her, the hiss of its passage through compacted earth, the click, click, click of its beak snapping together in anticipation of its prey. She needed height, needed to get off the sand and onto something solid where the creature couldn't follow. But the landscape was flat here, offering nothing in the way of refuge except those dark tunnel openings that represented a different kind of death. She veered left, then right, trying to break the creature's tracking, but it compensated instantly, its movements suggesting an intelligence that went beyond mere predatory instinct. Then she saw it, a dead tree, bleached white by sun and sand, its root system exposed where erosion had undermined the soil. It stood perhaps 12 feet tall, its branches twisted into shapes that looked like grasping hands. It was 30 yards away, maybe more, and she had no idea if her exhausted legs could carry her that far before the creature closed the distance. She put her head down and sprinted. Every muscle screamed in protest. Her lungs burned. Black spots danced across her vision. Behind her, the creature's pursuit became more aggressive, its movements generating vibrations she could feel through the ground, even as she ran. It was close. Too close. 20 yards, 15, 10. She reached the tree and leaped, her hands finding purchase on a low branch that creaked alarmingly under her weight. She hauled herself upward with strength born of pure desperation, her feet leaving the ground just as the creature lunged. Its beak snapped shut on empty air where her leg had been a second before, and the force of its momentum carried it past the tree to crash into the sand beyond. Maya climbed higher, not stopping until she was perched on a branch that was uncomfortably thin but at least 8 feet off the ground. Below, the creature circled the tree's base, its wedge-shaped head tilting upward to track her position. It made a sound, not the grinding of the larger creature, but something more organic, a chittering that rose and fell in pitch like some perverted form of communication. And then, answering calls came from other parts of the tunnel network. More creatures, drawn by the first one's hunting cry. Maya counted at least 4 distinct responses, coming from different directions, converging on her location. The dead tree would provide temporary sanctuary, but it was far from secure. If the creatures decided to work together, if they possessed the intelligence to coordinate their attack, they could bring the tree down through simple persistence. The night stretched ahead of her, and dawn was still hours away. Her position was precarious. Her supplies were exhausted. Her body was running on fumes and adrenaline and that mysterious liquid from the underground pool, which was already beginning to wear off as its effects dissipated through her system. But she was alive, still breathing, still capable of thought and action. And as long as those things remained true, she had a chance. The creatures circled below, their chittering growing more complex as they communicated in ways she couldn't begin to understand. More arrived, called by their fellows' hunting cries, until at least a dozen of the streamlined predators surrounded the tree. They took turns lunging at the trunk, testing its stability, learning its weaknesses. Several worked at the exposed roots, using their beaks to tear away the soil and sand that anchored the structure in place. Maya knew she couldn't stay here. The tree would fall eventually, whether from the creature's efforts or from its own precarious positioning in the unstable sand. When it did, she would be delivered directly into their midst, with no chance of escape. She needed a different strategy, a way to turn this impossible situation to her advantage. She studied the tunnel openings visible in the moonlight. The creatures had all emerged from those dark portals, which meant the passages were large enough to accommodate their bodies with room to spare. If she could somehow get into the tunnel system, could she move through it faster than they could follow? Could she find a passage too small for their streamlined forms, but adequate for her more compact human frame? It was insane. Every instinct she possessed screamed against deliberately entering the domain of creatures that had been hunting her since she first set foot in this cursed desert. But staying in the tree was certain death, and attempting to outrun a dozen predators across open sand was only slightly better odds. At least in the tunnels, she might be able to use the environment's complexity to her advantage. Maya waited for a moment when the creature's attention was focused on the tree's base, then dropped from her perch. She hit the sand and rolled, absorbing the impact and coming up in a crouch. The creatures reacted instantly, converging on her position with frightening speed. But she was already moving, sprinting toward the nearest tunnel opening with everything she had left. She reached the edge and didn't hesitate, throwing herself into the darkness without knowing what waited below. The drop was shorter than she expected, perhaps 6 feet before she hit a slope of compacted sand that sent her sliding downward into absolute blackness. Behind her, she heard the creatures following, their chittering reaching a frenzy as they realized their prey had entered their domain rather than trying to escape it. Maya clicked on her flashlight as she slid, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a tunnel that was both larger and more complex than she had imagined. The walls weren't just hollowed-out sand, but something more structured, reinforced in places with what looked like saliva or some other secretion that had hardened into a material with the consistency of cement. The tunnel branched and split, forming a network of passages that extended in all directions. She reached the bottom of the slope and scrambled to her feet, choosing a direction at random and running. The tunnel was high enough that she could move at nearly full speed, though the uneven floor threatened to trip her with every step. Behind her, she could hear the creatures entering the tunnel system, their chittering echoing off the walls in ways that made it impossible to judge their exact positions. The tunnel twisted and turned, rising and falling in ways that suggested it had been carved to follow some underlying geology that was invisible from the surface. Maya took every branch that seemed to lead generally northeast, trying to maintain her bearing despite the disorienting darkness. Her flashlight beam flickered, the batteries nearly dead, and she knew that when they finally died, she would be left in absolute darkness, with nothing but touch and sound to guide her. A creature appeared ahead, emerging from a side tunnel with its beak already snapping. Maya didn't slow down. She lowered her shoulder and rammed into the thing at full speed, using her momentum to knock it aside. Its beak grazed her arm, tearing through fabric and skin, but she was past it before it could recover and press the attack. More tunnels, more intersections. The network was vast, extending beneath the desert for miles in all directions. She wondered how many centuries or millennia these creatures had spent excavating these passages, how many generations had lived and died in this subterranean world without ever seeing the sun. The thought should have been disturbing, but instead she found herself feeling a strange kinship with them. They were survivors, just as she was trying to be. They had adapted to an impossible environment and found ways to thrive where nothing should be able to exist. Her flashlight died, plunging her into darkness so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eyes. Maya didn't stop. She kept running, one hand trailing along the tunnel wall to guide her, trusting her feet to find purchase on the uneven floor. The creature's pursuit continued, but something had changed. Their chittering had taken on a different quality, less aggressive and more questioning, as if her willingness to enter their domain had confused them, disrupted whatever predator-prey dynamic normally governed these interactions. Light appeared ahead. Not artificial light, but something natural, a faint blue-green glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Maya adjusted her course toward it, hope flaring in her chest. Natural light meant an exit, a way back to the surface. She could endure anything if she could just reach the open air again. The tunnel opened into a chamber, and Maya stumbled to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. The space was enormous, its dimensions impossible to judge in the uncertain light. The walls were covered in that same luminescent substance she had seen in the pool at the ancient structure, creating an illumination that was beautiful and eerie in equal measure. And covering every surface, walls, ceiling, floor, were the creatures. Hundreds of them, thousands, more than she could count. Their streamlined bodies coiled and curled around each other in dense masses that pulsed with a rhythm that suggested communication, or perhaps collective dreaming. They filled the chamber like a living carpet, their chittering reduced to a low susurrus that reminded her of wind through grass. And in the center of the chamber, rising from the floor like some geological formation, was a crystalline structure that pulsed with the same blue-green light as the walls. It was perhaps 20 feet tall, its surface faceted and complex, and Maya understood instinctively that this was important. This was the heart of something, the nexus point around which the entire tunnel system had been organized. The creatures pursuing her emerged from the tunnel behind her and immediately fell silent. They moved past her without aggression, flowing into the chamber to join their fellows in that strange mass of bodies. She was ignored completely, as if her presence no longer registered as a threat or even as something worth noting. Maya approached the crystal structure carefully, aware that she was trespassing in a space that was sacred, or at least significant to these creatures. Up close, she could see shapes moving within the crystal, shadows or reflections that seemed to have independent existence. Images flickered across its surface. The desert, as it had been, and as it was now. The transition from green paradise to barren waste. The retreat of life underground, and its transformation into forms that could survive in darkness. She reached out and touched the crystal's surface, and once again that flood of information poured into her consciousness. But this time it was different. This time she understood. The tunnel network wasn't just a hunting ground or a refuge. It was a monument, a memory preserved in stone and sand and the bodies of creatures that had adapted to carry that memory forward through generations. The life that had once covered the desert hadn't disappeared. It had transformed, retreated, waiting for conditions that might allow a return to the surface. And the ancient structures, the temples and cities that dotted the desert's surface as ruins, they had been built by the ancestors of these creatures, back when they wore forms more recognizable as humanoid. The tall figure she had encountered in the underground chamber hadn't been a separate species. It had been one of them, one of the ancient ones who had survived the transition and adapted differently, choosing to retain something closer to their original form, rather than fully embracing the streamlined predator shape required for efficient movement through sand. The vision released her, and Maya staggered backward, her mind reeling from the implication. The creatures around her remained motionless, their chittering replaced by a profound silence that felt like the pause between heartbeats. She understood that she had been judged and found, not threatening, not worth eliminating, or perhaps simply too different to process through their usual predator-prey framework. A tunnel opening on the chamber's far side beckoned with a different quality of light, the gray pre-dawn glow that meant morning was approaching. Maya made her way toward it, moving carefully to avoid disturbing the massed creatures. They parted for her when necessary, creating a path that led directly to the exit. She emerged into a narrow ravine, its walls steep but climbable, and hauled herself upward toward the surface. The sky was lightening in the east, bands of orange and pink announcing the sun's imminent return. Maya pulled herself over the ravine's edge and collapsed onto sand that was still cool from the night's chill. She had made it, through impossible odds and encounters that would sound like fever dreams if she ever tried to explain them. She had survived. The settlement was visible in the distance now, its lights twinkling in the pre-dawn gloom. Perhaps 20 miles away, maybe less. A distance that would have seemed insurmountable days ago but now felt almost manageable. She got to her feet, her body protesting every movement, and set out toward those lights, with the grim determination of someone who had learned that survival was less about strength or skill, and more about simply refusing to stop moving forward. The sun broke over the horizon as she walked, and the desert transformed once again into that hostile furnace she had come to know so well. But something had changed within her. She moved through the heat and glare with a confidence born of understanding. This place that had nearly killed her multiple times, this merciless waste that had tested her in ways she would never be able to fully articulate. It was also a place of wonder. A place where life had found ways to persist against odds that should have made existence impossible. She thought about the ancient structure and the pool with its luminescent water, about the segmented horror that had chased her and the streamlined predators that had nearly caught her, about the crystalline memory at the heart of the tunnel system, and the tall figure watching from the shadows. All of it connected, all of it part of a larger story that extended backward through time to an age when this desert had been something completely different. Hours passed. The settlement grew closer, its details becoming clearer as she approached. She could see vehicles now, buildings, people moving between structures, the trappings of human civilization that felt both familiar and alien after days of isolation in the wilderness. She wondered if she would be able to explain what had happened, if anyone would believe her stories of underground creatures and ancient memories preserved in crystal and water that granted visions of the past. Probably not, but that didn't matter. Some experiences existed outside the boundaries of language, too vast or too strange to be captured in mere words. What mattered was that she had survived. She had learned, and somewhere deep beneath the desert sand, in chambers lit by bioluminescence and populated by creatures that had mastered the art of existing in impossible places, her passage would be remembered as a brief disruption in patterns that had remained unchanged for millennia. The settlement's gates opened to admit her, and Maya allowed herself to be guided to medical facilities where her injuries could be treated and her body given the rest it so desperately needed. But even as the chaos of human concern swirled around her, even as questions were asked and stories demanded, her mind remained partially in that underground world she had glimpsed. The desert had marked her in ways that went beyond physical scars. She carried its lessons beneath her skin, written in a language older than words. She would return someday, not immediately. She needed time to heal, to process, to understand what she had experienced. But eventually, she would come back to these endless dunes and hostile spaces. There were more structures to find, more chambers to explore, more pieces of the desert's secret history to uncover. The creatures had shown her something profound when they allowed her passage through their domain, that understanding was possible even across the vast gulf that separated species and experience. And if you want to hear more stories from this desert, if you want to follow other journeys into places where the boundaries between life and death blur into something more complex, subscribe to Dark Desert Survival, because every dune hides secrets, every rock formation shelters mysteries, and every person who ventures into this merciless waste comes back changed, if they come back at all. Tell me in the comments, which moment from her journey through the underground shook you the most? Was it the segmented creature's first appearance? The vision from the luminescent pool? Or that final chamber filled with thousands of the streamlined hunters? I want to know what stayed with you.